Hello, and welcome to another episode of Sound Strategic. I'm Meia Nouwens, Senior Fellow for Chinese Security and Defense Policy at the IISS and host of the Sound Strategic podcast. In today's episode, we'll discuss the global trends in defense spending, with a particular focus on Europe and Germany. Both at the European Union and member state levels, Europeans are signaling that the time has come for Europe to be primarily responsible for its own defense. Part of this decision stems from what Europeans see as the changing relations with the United States under the second Trump administration. However, spending more euros on defense won't be enough on its own. How will Europeans work with non-European defense industrial partners? What will be key areas of investment? And lastly, what challenges lie ahead? Joining me in today's episode to help us understand what these policy changes are and give their view on the likelihood of success are three of my distinguished colleagues from the IISS. Fenella McGerty, Senior Fellow for Defense Economics, Ester Sabatino, Research Associate for Defense and Military Analysis, and Ben Schreer, Executive Director of IISS Europe and Director for Defense, Technology, and Future Conflict. Fenella, Ester, and Ben, welcome back onto the show. Fenella, starting with you, can you maybe talk us through the global defense budget trends that we've seen over the last 12 months?
Over the last 12 months, we've really seen global defense spending growth both intensify and become more widespread, which is reflecting the intensifying security challenges that's affecting most regions globally now. Last year, we saw global spending reach $2.46 trillion, and that was an increase from $2.24 trillion the previous year. So growth is accelerating. We saw 7.4% real terms uplift in 2024, outpacing the increases in 2023 and 2022. The pervasiveness is really interesting. I think beyond the increases you would expect in Russia and Ukraine and Europe, we also saw increases accelerate in the Middle East, North Africa region to around 10% in real terms as Israel-Hamas war intensified and regional instability spread. As you might expect, growth was driven by a surge in Israeli defense spending, but we also saw growth in markets like Algeria, which is now actually spending over 8% of its GDP on defense, which is second only to Ukraine globally in that measure. So whether spending in that region will remain elevated or revert to prior trend levels is going to hinge on ongoing kind of negotiations in terms of the ceasefire arrangements and the security situation in the wider region. Beyond the Europe, Middle East and North Africa region, I think if we look at Asia as well, defence spending growth there continued at a moderate pace in 2024. Growth there has been so consistent over the last decade, and that continuity comes as the usual strategic drivers, so China's military modernisation, North Korea's advancing nuclear weapons program has really galvanised threat perceptions in the region. Even though we're seeing stronger increases in the region's larger, more mature economies like Japan and Australia, we're still seeing growth in China's defense budget outpace the wider region. China is continuing to account for a larger share of regional spending. So that's where all the growth lay. I think if you then turn to the US, defense spending there has been fairly constrained by the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023. So when you look over the last decade, European spending has steadily increased as a proportion of GDP over the last decade. There's been a real concerted effort to do that. When you look at the US, it's actually stagnating, if not falling slightly. The caps also limited the flexibility that the country has to increase spending against an expanding range of challenges as well. So the military support for Ukraine and Israel was funded through supplemental funding in the US because of this cap on the core budget. And I think the overall impact of Donald Trump's return to the presidency is still fairly ambiguous because you obviously have the impact of the savings that have been announced and the sort of efficiencies that are being sought and the programs that are coming under fire set against the new priorities of the new administration. So even though these savings have been requested, it's more likely that a lot of the funding will be redistributed to different priorities. You will have both winners and losers, and it will be the ability and agility of industry to adapt and to see where the opportunities lie as to whether they will win or lose from these changes. So ultimately, it's a balance of factors. There would also be potential downward pressure if the move away from European security means a reduction in military aid for Ukraine. ultimately, even though that was funded through supplemental budgets, that would have a dampening effect at the top level. So it's a bit of a, as I say, a balance of factors looking at the US defense budget at the moment. And in terms of the other regions where we didn't see as much growth, Latin America, we're still seeing regional spending yet to recover from the pandemic-related cuts. So spending hasn't actually gotten back to pre-pandemic levels. And that's because of lingering financial pressures and low threat perceptions in the region. They just have different priorities. It's domestic security, it's border security. The threats that would determine major increases in defense spending aren't prevalent there. And I think the only region that we didn't see real terms increases in 2024 was Sub-Saharan Africa. We saw spending decline by 3.7% in real terms. And that's really just hampered by high inflation, but also really differing trends across the region. We actually saw significant growth in countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, members of the Alliance of Sahel States. But we saw cuts in key actors like Nigeria. So it's the balance there as well. So it's a real reflection of the different security impacts across the region. Generally, obviously, we saw huge growth in Russian spending, and that has prompted, alongside the war in Ukraine, a record level of growth in European spending. We saw 11.7% real growth last year in response to that ongoing war in Ukraine, but also that push to get to, the 2% of GDP on defence in the region last year. And it's a question of going forward whether we would sustain spending at higher levels or continue increases.
How sustainable are these increases that we've seen in European defense spending, Fenella?
Yeah, I think the growth so far has been really impressive, but it does mask underlying trends. When we saw this acceleration in growth, the pace is very impressive, but it was achieved through a variety of mechanisms. We saw off-budget defense funds. It was because of the inclusion of military aid to Ukraine. In some cases, it was a redefinition of spending to fall under the umbrella of defence, still within NATO guidelines, but it's still a recalculation rather than an actual uplift of core domestic defence spending. As well, if we look at future growth, Europe often decides or proposes the following year's budget in the autumn. So we did actually have an idea of what 2025 spending was going to be, and it was set to be more muted. If you looked certainly beyond the Nordic countries, there were still significant increases planned there. But other countries were thinking, now we've got to the 2%, we maintain spending at this level because it has required hard choices so far. So any further increases are creating a more acute pressure on the fiscal health and balances within these countries. Since concerns have mounted regarding the reliability of the US as a strategic ally in the region, we've seen a wave of other announcements and uplifts for defence over the course of the beginning of 2025. So the UK choosing to cut foreign aid in order to bolster defence spending by 2027. Belgium has also decided to accelerate the pace at which they are going to increase funding for defence. Denmark has announced a defence acceleration fund. And obviously Germany, we've seen significant initiatives there that I'm sure we'll talk about later. And then at the EU level, we also have these initiatives, including the Rearm Europe programme. But I think the concerns about the affordability are significant, and any moves to enable countries to extend deficits to fund defence are necessary, but they have to be used carefully. Currently, a situation where a lot of countries in Europe are quite fiscally extended. They're well beyond the spending as a proportion of GDP, sort of the 3% kind of recommended limit, where you might incur extra scrutiny on your budget. These countries have really limited fiscal headroom, so it's a combination of policy measures now going forward, increased taxation, savings elsewhere in the public purse, utilising the private sector more and more to find ever more creative ways of finding this money for defence in Europe.
Esther, turning to you, Fenella had mentioned the new initiatives in the European Union. Can you talk us through some of these new initiatives that seek to boost defense industry and spending?
On the 19th of March, the European Commission published two main documents that are going to affect defense and defense industrial cooperation. And one of these is the white paper on defense, while the other one is funding package proposal, which is a part of the Rearm Europe plan, which is called Security Action for Europe. These two documents are quite relevant at the moment because actually the white paper, it starts with an assessment of the threats and strategic environment in Europe at the moment. And this is particularly relevant because among European countries, there are, as Fenella was alluding to in her reply, there are some countries that are having some hard time in finding the right balance and devoting additional fundings to defense at the expenses of other costs. So having a proper understanding understanding of what the threats and the strategic environment is extremely relevant to channel, so to say, the defense investments at the moment. And the white paper aims, first of all, to continue the support to Ukraine by strengthening the deliveries of the different ammunitions and air defense capabilities, but not only, and also to strengthen the industry in Ukraine, most importantly, inside the European Union. So to strengthen the defense technological and industrial base, all of this to meet the NATO capability priorities, potentially through the defense projects of common European interest. These projects are actually very well-known capability gaps in Europe that the white paper identified, like air missile defense, artillery, drones and counter-UAV systems, but also military mobility and electronic warfare, for example. And the plan at the moment with this new proposal is to increase as much as possible the joint procurement of these gaps to build on economies of scales and improve interoperability as well that will result from this additional cooperation. One aspect that I think is particularly relevant when talking about the defense industrial capacity in Europe, which is the creation potentially of strategic stockpiles of products in the EU to basically give the possibility to have strategic reserves of materials and components that are relevant for the production of the most needed type of products. And to do this, the Commission is working towards the development of strategic dialogue with industry that is going to address issues like the access to finance, for example, how to really implement and change the ESG criteria to allow for the inclusion of defense companies as well. And this leads me to the other instrument to which I was referring to, which is the Security Action for Europe funding package proposal. So this 150 billion pot of money that is going to be hopefully used for the support of common procurement. I'm saying hopefully used because at the moment this is just a regulation proposal. So member states and European Parliament will have to go through the proposal and decide how to allow for its final shape. But SAFE, it's basically looking at increasing joint procurement capacities by strengthening the manufacturing capabilities around Europe, as well as better preparing the different infrastructures on the different capability gaps. There is one aspect in the regulation which is particularly relevant here, which is for the joint procurement to have at least 65% of the costs of the component have to be made in Europe, which means only the remaining 35% can come from cooperation with non-EU companies and entities. But there is also another aspect, which is the requirement for the design authority of this equipment to remain inside of the Union. This mostly done to, on the one hand, to strengthen the defense industry, but on the other hand, also not to have dependencies on third countries particularly.
All of this, of course, is hugely ambitious, but what do you think the challenges are going to be to actually implementing this?
The challenges may be quite a few. There is now the list of identified capability gaps among European countries, which is not a problem per se. The problem is that now member states will have to really act on those and so start to issue common procurement and common orders to have then also the production of this equipment. There is one aspect which is of a most strategic relevance, which is related exactly to the person that I was mentioning just a moment ago, because this means that at the moment cooperation with entities coming from the US or from the UK as well as from other countries is not possible. And this represents a challenge, particularly in certain specific sectors that may be overcome by what it's included in both in the white paper and the SAFE instrument through the so-called security and defense partnerships. And it's interesting to see at the moment that the EU has this kind of partnerships with countries like Norway, Moldova, South Korea, Japan, North Macedonia, for example. Such an agreement is not present with the US, the UK, or Turkey. And so this raises some real questions on the capacity of the European defense technological and industrial base to produce at speed now what's really needed. The potential solution could be to have an agreement with the countries in question, with the mindset that the European Union does not want to focus on one specific relationship, just to have that kind of a strong relationship with one specific country, but is now opened the door for a more variety and the way that it cooperates on defense industry as well with non-EU countries.
Ben, turning to you, can you please talk us through what's happening in Germany? There's a change of government that's taking place, and of course, also plans for a renewed and historically large defense budget.
Thanks, Meia. Well, last week we really had an important vote going through both chambers in Germany, where now defense spending above 1% of Germany's GDP is effectively exempt from the country's so-called debt brake. And what that means is that any German government in the future could spend, 2, 3, 4, or even 8% of GDP on defense if it then decided to do so. So that is a huge decision for this new incoming German government who will take office. And what it does is that it provides a significant opportunity for the biggest economy in Europe to lead the way when it comes to recapitalization of European defense capability development. It allows, the Bundeswehr to more systematically, if it's done correctly, address some of the severe shortfalls that it has been facing given decades of underinvestment before Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. And you might recall that after that invasion, the then German government already announced a special fund of about 100 billion, but that money is already almost spent. So what this decision now does of last week is effectively allowing the German government, if they then want to, agree on long-term uplifts, which will provide defense companies also with greater certainties, drive investment in new factories, people, and the like. And it would provide the German government with an opportunity to really assume that leadership in the military domain in Europe that also a lot of its neighbors have been calling for such a long time. So Germany could really then assume leadership when it comes to conventional military power in Europe, simply because of the size of its overall economy. If Germany would be spending, let's say, 2 to 3% or 3% of GDP, that would make it easily the third largest defense spender in the world. So the window has opened to address those vulnerabilities, to provide leadership, and the window has opened for Germany to play that military leadership that arguably now, with the US seemingly to turn away from Europe, that Europe just so desperately needs. So Germany is now in a good position, hopefully then, to be able to develop more capable defense forces alongside France, the United Kingdom, and other European powers.
And what are the challenges to this new approach?
Well, I guess the 500 billion euro question, so to speak, is whether that long-term growth in defense spending above at least 2% will actually be forthcoming. We now see successive German governments invest 3, maybe even 4% over the next decades annually in defense. As a reminder that during the heydays of the Cold War, Germany was spending way in excess of 4% of GDP on defense. And that is needed and would be needed because lots of more money is required to just fill in all of those gaps. We're still in the process across Europe, but also in the German Bundeswehr, to not just having to buy hardware, but also invest in software, upgrading military facilities, investing in more people, and that costs a lot of money. So 500 billion, the figure that has been thrown around last week, is a welcomed investment of fresh money, but it only goes so far. So the question also is, where will this additional money be invested? What is the time frame? I think the question for any German government now needing to invest more in defense is where to make cuts. Do you make cuts in other parts of the budget, the federal budget, or do you base it simply on more debt, which is already domestically, shall we say, not uncontroversial, even though at the moment, and given the debt levels of the German economy, that seems manageable. But at some point, it might become a domestic problem, particularly if we are then having a change in government again in a couple of years' time. So really the question is, going back to the start, the opportunity now is there, but will successive German governments actually seize the opportunity, invest in defense spending levels which go way beyond 2%, because that's what's needed.
I really want to ask everyone a last question. What is your prediction for the next 12 months as to whether or not the trends that we've seen at the moment in Europe are actually going to unfold as we think they are, or should we be watching out for other wild card scenarios?
Well, maybe I can start. I think the pain threshold is already very high, and it will continue simply because I do not see the Trump administration changing its approach fundamentally, where it seems that European allies are now seen as almost an adversary, not a partner anymore. At least when I think about the German case, the announcements that have been made by a German chancellor on no longer being able to rely on the US ally, really historic. That has never come from any German government, and particularly Friedrich Merz, who is a long-term transatlanticist, a really dedicated supporter of NATO and a strong German-US relationship. And if someone like him makes such public statements, I think it shows you how deeply and profound the concerns are. So I am cautiously optimistic for the next, shall we say, 12 to 24 months, noting that, of course, there could be these wild cards that you've been referring to. For example, what happens if we're having a Le Pen government in France in only 2 years' time, which would deal a huge blow probably to any attempt to have a more concerted European approach to this.
If I can jump in on the European level, I think that for so many years there have been discussions around increasing the European capacity to really act and perform when it comes to defense and defense industry in particular. The direction is going towards the right one, in the sense that there are now several activities being put on the table, but we can also see that specifically additional money are being founded in a way or in another. It is extremely relevant, for instance, that during the last year, the European Union was able to finance with the EU budget the ramp up of the ammunition and missile sectors, also to provide joint financing for joint procurement with initial money, but this is really a new chapter in EU cooperation. And the fact that there are so many additional dialogues and initiatives, also, for instance, to change the mandate of the European Investment Bank to allow for the use of additional fundings for the defense sector. I think these are all steps that need time to be implemented, to be put in place. But then I suppose that we will really start to see the results of these instruments in the next 2 to 3 years, provided, however, the member state continue to have that dedicated and increasing amount of defense spending, not only to equipment, but particularly to research and development of new systems, of new products, in light of the fact that the US are diminishing their support to Europe.
And just from my point of view, I think it'll be really telling to see how potentially attitude shifts on the private side to try and bolster investment from private financing into defence, whether we see the translation of the shifts in the rules to actual increases in investment from venture capital, private equity towards defence. I think the messaging has gotten really strong across Europe, and it's whether we see that having an impact on the individual who are investing with their bank, and whether that message then gets through, whether they will be happy for funds to be invested in defence, or whether there's still the mentality that defence does not comply with environmental social governance standards. So I'll be very keen to see whether it translates and whether we actually see an uptick in activity to ensure Europe remains competitive and we see innovation and investment in R&D at the sort of startup level in Europe.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. That's all we have time for today. So thank you, Ben, Fenella, and Ester for sharing your insights. And thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode. You can find more information on the topics discussed in today's episode in our show notes. Please do follow, rate, and subscribe to Sound Strategic wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts to keep up to date with all the latest episodes. Thank you and see you next time.